Yeah, tonight we're going to look at the dark side of technology. Given that you all had to come here through a rainstorm, I probably should have done a naval topic tonight, but I decided we'll stick with this one. So again, the World War I Museum and the Linda Hall Library has been exploring the issue of technology, and really the technologies that evolve out of the Great War have really established warfare as we know it today. In other words, some of the stuff that you're seeing happening here from 1914 to 1918 are playing out time and time again in places like the Ukraine today. Which brings us to sort of a warning. There is always a delta, a difference between the wars that armies imagine in peacetime and the wars that they plan for, and ultimately the wars that they get. Now, there's a host of reasons for this. A lot of it goes back to the writings of Karl von Clausewitz, the great Prussian soldier and theorist, who says, look, war is a contest of wills, where the enemy dictates as much to me as I dictate to them. And because of that, when you go to war, you want to win, but the enemy also wants to win. Now, who is here have heard of the term keeping up with the Joneses? Show of hands. Okay, pretty common phrase, not as much as you would think with my modern students, okay? Since war is naturally on this escalatory phase, where you're going to pull out all the stops to win before the enemy does, war is keeping up with the Joneses so you can kill them. That's pretty depressing. And what Michael Howard warns armies, and they so seldom pay attention to this, is whatever doctrine that you're working on now, whatever theory or idea that you have of the war that you're going to fight is going to be wrong. And when you find out it's wrong, the key is then to quickly put the changes into place, the organizational, the doctrine, the technological, to try to gain that asymmetric advantage. Now, we're going to start here. I actually get extra milk and cookies if I mention the Industrial Revolutions at the Linda Hall Library. I'm just saying, okay? But without starting with some of the major changes, especially those that come with the second industrial revolution, you really can't have the weapons development that you see that really guides the course of the Great War. And these you're probably familiar with. And Bessemer and Siemens, they're the guys that allowed these nations to create high quality, cheap steel. And this high-quality, cheap steel will be the source of all the major weapon systems. And in fact, the key to the major weapon systems of the Great War. And that'll be artillery. And that's what I'm going to talk about mostly today. Artillery was the big killer of the battlefield. Nearly 70% of the war's casualties are caused by shell fire. But you also have to have changes like what's being brought on by Paul Viel. Prior to 1884, modern weapons are given by gunpowder, black powder. What Paul Viel does is introduce chemical power, which not only increased the lethality, explosive power of shells, but also the ability to fire those shells at ever greater ranges. Now, I personally like the quote, and I'll probably get kicked out of here for saying this one, of what Terry Pratchett says, the great fantasist, satiricist. Progress just means bad things happen faster. And as we'll see in the years leading up to Great War, nowhere is that really more true than the time between 1865, the end of the American Civil War, and 1918. In fact, I'd go so far to argue that there's more military technological change that happens in that 50-odd years than the previous 4 millennia of warfare combined. So you're taking all of those developments that are coming out of the Industrial Revolution. Not only are you now increasing the quality of the steel, but fertile minds are also putting this towards the creation of ever new and more lethal weapon systems. And you can see that evolution. On the left side here, you have the weapon systems of the American Civil War. And on the right, the ones that you're going into World War I with. Exponential increase in range, in accuracy, in lethality, and number of shells fired. But for the purpose of this, we're going to start with this one. As I like to tell my field artillery students, Who's your daddy? Here's your daddy. The French, as we so often forget, are really one of the leading technological development, military technological developers of most of the 18th and 19th century. This is one of their masterpieces, the French 75 millimeter gun. This is the world's first modern artillery piece. Now, there's a couple of things that make it modern. It does have a slick breech operating mechanism, unlike the cannons of the Civil War that loaded from the muzzle. So this is an evolutionary design. It is also firing fixed ammunition. Anybody ever been to a Gallagher show? Never mind. Well, I'll tell you that. Fixed ammunition. So in one handy-dandy package, you have the propellant charge, you have the shell, you have the fuse, and you have the igniter, which makes it very easy to load. The actual shell weight of this is only 16 pounds, but when packed with high explosive, that pops quite a wallop. But the most important thing that makes this modern is what's right under the barrel here. It has a hydraulic recoil mechanism. Now this is going to really matter. This is going to be the game changer. If you've ever seen a Civil War cannon fire, the minute that you pull the lanyard, the cannon fires, and the recoil makes that cannon roll several feet back. And then the crew has to laboriously move it back into position, re-aim the gun, and fire. That's one of the reasons why in the American Civil War you were lucky if you're getting off a round and a half a minute for a field artillery piece. With that hydraulic recoil mechanism, when you fire it, the barrel stays just like this. So once you lay that gun, with a fixed breech, with the fixed ammunition and that slick breech operator, that hydraulic recoil mechanism, the French artillerymen are capable of a surge rate of fire of 20 rounds a minute. In other words, for a period of time, the artilleryman can fire that cannon as rapidly as an infantryman can fire their rifle. The minute this hits the street, every other artillery piece in the world is obsolete. And so we know what's going to happen next. Keeping up with the Joneses so you can kill them. Now, in the face of all this lethal technology, all of the armies of Europe are trying to figure out what it means. They have seen this technology. They've seen it in the Russo-Japanese War, in the Boer War, and 2 Balkan Wars. So they know that something is changing. They know that the lethality is increasing on the battlefield. But they don't know what to do about it. For the French, the 75 gun is going to be the solution to the problem. How do I get my infantrymen to get up, cross that fire-swept ground, cross that ground that is covered in rifle fire and machine gun fire and even the enemy's artillery fire? We'll roll this cannon up as close to the infantry as possible and do what the French call a rafale. We'll just fire it and fire it and fire it, and it'll either kill enough of the defenders or keep their heads down long enough to give my infantrymen a hope in hell of crossing that fire-swept ground. And in all of the armies of Europe, they're operating under the short war delusion. In fact, this is a sickness that affects a lot of armies. Because if you get a quick, decisive victory, all of the inherent ickiness of war goes away. You get to go to war with the army you've got, with the equipment that you have. You don't have to go back to the people to ask for more. By the time they start asking ugly questions, the war is over. That's also reflected, though, in their logistics preparation for war. If you're planning for a quick, decisive victory, you put your money in things that are going to get you instant gratification. If you plan for an ugly, long war, you put your money in other pots. Just to give you an idea here, when the French go to war, the go-to-war stockage for the French 75 is about 1,200 rounds. In other words, 1,200 of those shells is supposed to get that cannon through the entirety of the war. Now, the British are a little cheaper. This is the British 18-pound gun. They have a go-to-war stockage of 1,000 rounds. But since the Brits are cheap, only 173 of those rounds are actually with the cannons when they go into battle. Another 300 are reserved in Britain. So if you need it, we'll take it out of the cases and move it forward. The rest are on 6-month back order. And you won't need it because you'll be home by Christmas. And in World War I, they were right. You'll be home by Christmas. They just didn't tell you what year. Now, our problem, of course, is it's not what you got. Million men, armies slamming into each other in Belgium and France. And while the generals understood this was going to be an ugly, bloody war, this was nowhere in their comprehension. And now you got the war you got, not the war you want. Now, funny thing about soldiers. Soldiers will tell you very quickly when something is wrong. And by the time you get to November of 1914, what the soldiers of the major powers have figured out, that if I get up and try to cross that fire-swept ground, I am going to die. So all of the major armies on the Western Front start to dig in. And by the time you get to December of 1914, you have nearly an unbroken line of troops and trenches going over 400 miles from the North Sea coast of Belgium all the way down to the Franco-Swiss border. Unprecedented in human history. Now, these are what these trenches look like. And anybody who's an infantryman will tell you, these are not good trenches. They're very narrow. They're just straight line cuts in the ground. They lack what we call overhead cover to protect you from shell fire. And if you wanted to dig these soldiers out of these trenches at this time, you could do it. You just need a few things. You need a lot of fresh troops. Oh, but this is not the war you planned. You don't have a plan to bring up more reserves. So now you're going to have to take time to mobilize more and train more. Oh, the other thing that'll dig these guys out is very heavy, high explosive firing artillery. But that's not the war you intended. The French 75 is a light field piece that's going to operate much the way that artillery operated in the Napoleonic War. I don't have the heavy artillery. I do not have the shells. The British figured that out pretty quick. You fire up those 175 rounds, they're gone. You wire back to Britain, send me 300 more, then they're gone. Then you got that 500 on back order. You know how many Germans you can kill with a requisition form? I mean, like a paper cut, okay? The French are in the same position, that by October of 1914, just 2 months into the war, all of their pre-war stockage has been exhausted. And they're only producing about 10,000 rounds a month. Now, here's the problem. By the time that industry starts to crank out those shells and those cannons, and the fresh troops start to make it to the front, the trenches go from this to this. And now you have a monumental problem. The trenches are not just one belt of trenches. They're arrayed in depth, usually 3 trench belts deep. And it's not only that they're going laterally and in depth, they're also going subterranean as the troops try to cower from the powering, killing power of the artillery. Now, let me show you why this is a problem. Thanks to a couple of new technologies, we're going to talk about the development of artillery, but also about a number of the spin-off technologies that come along with this. You can now fly an airplane over the enemy's lines, take pictures, and from that, develop pretty good intelligence maps. So this is an Australian intelligence map from the area of the town of Ypres. Based upon their analysis, you have here 3 German divisions basically defending 3 miles by 4 miles. 3 miles by 4 miles. Within this small 3 by 4 mile area, you have the equivalent of every man, woman, and child in my town of Leavenworth and Lansing. Now, traditional military thinking is if you're going to take out the defender like this, you have to have a 3-to-1 advantage. So to take out every man, woman, and child of Leavenworth and Lansing in 3 by 4 miles, you would require every man, woman, and child in Kansas City, Kansas. But there's new math in World War I. When you're attacking here, 3-to-1's not going to work. You need 5-to-1. You need 6-to-1. So it's not only every man, woman, and child in Kansas City, Kansas, but you're going to probably need a lot more from Overland Park and Shawnee Mission just to give you the force ratio that you need. Now let's talk about the challenge here and how artillery fits into this. First thing you got to do is easy. You get up out of your trench and cross no man's land. What could be easier, right? You know why they call it no man's land, right? No man can live there. That's why we should have recruited a lot more women. I'm just saying, okay? Because the minute that you step out of your trench, the enemy sees all of you and you see maybe that much of them. And the minute that you step out of your trench, they're going to hit you with everything that they have. All those rifles, all those machine guns, all that artillery. Oh, just for fun, forward of those trenches is staked in barbed wire. This is German barbed wire from the Battle of the Somme. In fact, I dug it up from about right here, okay? Now, if you know anything about Germans, they tend to be a little anal retentive. That's some pretty nasty barbed wire. It is staked in 8 to 10 yards deep. Now, it's there to hold your infantry in no man's land as long as possible so you can tear them up. It's not designed to stop you, but to slow you down to inflict casualties. So now we need the artillery, this new or improved tool, to give your infantry a hope in hell of doing that task. So this is what you want the artillery to do. First, you must destroy the barbed wire. If the artillery can't crush the barbed wire, then the infantry guys are out there with little wire cutters, and that's bad. That's hazardous to one's health. The other thing you need to do is destroy those machine guns. If artillery is the number one killer, machine guns are the second killer. Oh, it'd probably help to either destroy the trenches, kill as many defenders as possible, or at least keep them down in those deep dugouts to where they can't return fire. Last thing you're going to do, and we'll talk about this a bit later, is the creeping barrage. So, if you've done task 1, then you can move on to task 2. You have to break into the first defensive belt. Now, the enemy's been here for a while. You're living in their backyard. So this is discovery learning as you jump in. Now, as you jump in here, you know very well that the German doctrine is the minute that you lose a trench, you automatically counterattack. So as the war goes on, the artillery will get a new mission, a box barrage, which basically lays an artillery barrage around your point of penetration so the Germans can't attack into it. But you're not done. If you've been lucky enough to cross no man's land and break into the first set of trenches, you are done. Your soldiers are tired, they're low on ammunition, they've lost a lot of officers and NCOs, and they've lost a lot of casualties. You still have 2 more belts to go. So, as you're completing that, the artillery is now moving on to prepping the second belt, everything you just did before. And a whole new set of troops have to go through that same process. Cross no man's land, go through the first set of trenches, and then continue the attack on to the second belt. Oh, there's more. If you've done all that stuff, you get to go on to the third. Whoops, I'm a little hit myself there. You get to go on to the third belt, rinsing and repeating every step you go. Now, the problem, of course, is you've got some limitations to your artillery. So at some point in time, you've got to cease firing some of your guns to move them closer so they can continue this mission. If you've accomplished step 1, step 2, and step 3, then and only then can you go into step 4. Finally, push the enemy out of their trenches into the open where you believe you can destroy them there. But there's a challenge there too. You've got to continue to do the artillery support as you go, but at some point in time, you've got to change your whole direction. Your artillery has been focused on trench warfare, and now they've got to refocus again on mobile warfare. And in the support of the mobile warfare, you've got to keep the Germans from stopping and digging back in again. This is a tall order. And the thing that's going to allow you to do this is a completely new science. Indirect fire versus direct fire. If you think of the cannons of the Civil War, the cannons of the Napoleonic period, or even the cannons that the French and the Germans were operating in 1914, they are using what we call direct fire. In other words, I can see the target, I can shoot the target. Now, as early as 1881, a Russian soldier had posited the idea of doing indirect fire. In other words, actually lobbing artillery shells beyond the sight of the gunners. This is going to be critical for World War I. You can't get plunging fire into the trenches if you're doing direct fire. So I'm going to be able, if I can get indirect fire, I can now lob those into the trenches to suppress or kill as many of the defenders, but also go deeper to try to rob the enemy of their big hammer, their artillery. But you got to go from a textbook to reality. And you got to do it in an extremely short amount of time. You're inventing a whole new science and a whole new host of technologies to accomplish this indirect fire. You've got to still be able to see the target from some direction, artillery, from observation balloons, from observation towers, from aircraft, to accurately lay the artillery in beyond the sight of the gunners. You have to figure out the math. Now, I am a history major, which means to count to 20, I must take off my shoes. To do the calculations required to get the right angles and the right distance, you start to issue your artillerymen with a slide ruler. Okay? This is a British slide rule, artillery slide rule from 1917. Don't ask me how it works. What part of history major don't you understand? Okay? But to tell you how deep this science is going, that should be an indicator. And as the war goes on, you have to figure out new sciences and how they contribute to warfare. How does meteorology contribute to warfare? Because humidity, the weather will have an effect on the flight of that artillery piece or that artillery shell. The tube wear, the more that you fire the cannon, the more the rifling gets worn out, that'll have an effect on the accuracy of the weapon. So as you're going along, you're figuring out all of that stuff. If artillery is your big killer, it's also the enemy's big killer. So increasingly you have to put a lot of thought into how do I eliminate their guns. So you get things like sound ranging. You put microphones here, and then a half kilometer over, you put another microphone there. When an enemy artillery battery fires, the microphones pick up the sound, you triangulate it, and can break artillery down to take out those cannons. They'll do the same thing with flash ranging. In other words, every time that cannon fires, it creates a big flash. So you have two observers looking, not as effective as sound ranging, but the point is they're figuring all of this stuff out by doing it. You have no other choice. Sadly, few things push forward technological development more than war. And the cost of not keeping up with the Joneses here means that your soldiers are the ones that are being killed. We have another problem. Oftentimes what happens in warfare is technological lags. So as we've seen, since 1865, the pace of weapons development has gone through the roof and constantly keeps building that lethality throughout World War I. But while the weapons technology lethality has gone through the roof, the command and control technology, the communications technology is flat. You start the war with some Spark radio sets. That's where you carry them around with in 1914, 1915. They weigh over 1,000 pounds. They're only down to the core level, so it's not something that's really going to help you on the battlefield. Your most advanced communications are what you see here. So you've got flag signals, almost as old as war. Hey, you know what you look like on a World War I battlefield doing flag signals? A suicidal cheerleader, okay? Please shoot me, okay? Pigeons. No. They don't fly at night. They don't like shell fire. That tells you there's a problem. And they're very slow. Oh, by the way, the pigeons have to be taken to the front line in big baskets. If the shells start to go off and you flop on the basket, sorry about that, okay? Or if you've been cut off by the enemy shell fire for a couple of days, Mr. Pigeon looks like chicken. Just saying. The most advanced that you have going into World War I for tactical communication is actually landline, a telephone, okay? But you got a problem. The telephone wire goes from forward command or rear command post to front command post to front command post. It doesn't go laterally. So it generally peters out at the battalion, if you're lucky, the company level. So not down to where the troops need it. Oh, by the way, if you're attacking, you have to take the telephone along with you. That's what it looks like. So you got some poor Joe with all of his weapons and equipment carrying a spool of wire on their back, a 50-pound roll of wire on their back that naturally spools out as they go on a leisurely stroll across no man's land. And you know what that guy looks like? Chicken. Yeah, not a job that you really want, right? Not unless your life insurance is paid up. What this means is it's impossible to get responsive artillery fires. You can't do what we do today, where every sergeant, every lieutenant in the U.S. Army can pick up a radio and call for artillery fire, and it magically rains down from the heavens. It's not going to happen. The technology is not there to support it. So you make some workarounds. Remember I talked to you about that creeping barrage. The creeping barrage is there to try to give your infantry a hope of crossing no man's land and then the subsequent trenches. The idea is actually sound, that we're going to drop a curtain of shells in front of the attacking infantrymen. But since the communications isn't up to standard, you come up with something like this. This is your barrage order. And so you see that you've got this cut across. Every one of those lines is a timeline, which means at this time, the shells are going to fire along that line. And then they will creep forward to the next line. You tell your infantry guys to lean into the barrage. You're even willing to accept up to 10% casualties of friendly shells to do this. As you continue to go, as long as you're right behind that barrage, it should keep falling right to the moment that you jump into the enemy trench. Hopefully, and there's a word you never want to hear more, hopefully, okay, you will catch them deep down their dugouts where you'll have them an advantage. You never want to do war by rigid timelines. If anything happens, an unsuppressed machine gun position, an infantry platoon that you did not destroy, the barbed wire did not cut properly, the fire plan is going to continue to roll on, and it will never come back. Again, I also like spin-off technologies. I did 23 years in the Army, mostly in tanks. I'm an old tank guy. So I've got a special place in my heart for, well, tanks. Tanks exist or come out in 1916 because you have to admit that the artillery can't do all the stuff the artillery promises to do. It's not responsive. A tank is essentially mobile, protected firepower. If the artillery can't cut the wire, the tanks with those treads will be able to drive over the top of it. If the artillery didn't destroy all the German machine gun positions, you have machine guns and cannons on the tanks to take them out. But the problem with all emerging technology is it's emerging technology. The first time the tanks are used in the Battle of the Somme on the 15th of September 1916, there are only 40 tanks in the world. 38 of them are committed to the battle. By the end of that first day of the tanks being used, only 8 of them are still operational at the end of the day. And even by the time you get to the Black Day of the German Army and the Ludendorff Offensive in 8th of August 1918, where the British now have 300 and 400 tanks moving forward, after 3 days of operating, they're down to the teens. Great technology, it just hasn't caught up with the reality yet. You also have to answer certain questions here. What are you going to try to do here? Are you going to go through all of the trenches? Are you only going to, what the French call grignotage, nibble. I grab, I take a bite, I hold. Are you going to do a hurricane bombardment or a long bombardment? Hurricane bombardment is you throw everything as quick as you can, as fast as you can, hoping that that's going to catch the enemy by surprise and do all the destruction. Or do you want a long bombardment? Long bombardment has a better chance of perhaps destroying more of the enemy. The problem, of course, is you give up all hope of surprise. Are you going to do neutralizing fires, which means I'm not destroying everything, I'm just suppressing the enemy, keeping them down in the hole, keeping their artillery from being effective, or am I actually trying to destroy all this stuff? And in the hard math problems of how many shells do I need on each phase of the operation to accomplish my tasks? We're going to see this really come into focus in 1916 in two places, Verdun and the Somme. Now, the Germans are going to launch a massive attack in February of 1916 on the French town of Verdun. Their hope is to sucker the French into doing an all-out attack to stop the German push, thus bleeding the French army white. You see the amount of preparation. This is giving you some of the idea of how big these wars are becoming. 2 million shells during the first 6 days, 2 million more shells in the subsequent 12 days. And all the logistics planning that's going into this. And look at the density. You've got one division per every mile of front, and that division is being backed up by 150 cannons. And it starts to work. You see the German advance here. But because the Germans have tried to limit this attack, to not spend all their human resources, they make a fundamental error. And what's known as the left bank of the Meuse River, on the heights of the Meuse, the French have dug in all of their artillery. All those fast-firing 75 millimeter guns. A part of the name of this presentation was Black Butchers. The French artillerymen wear a very dark blue uniform. And from 1914 onwards, the Germans start to call them the Black Butchers because of the damage that they can do. So even though the Germans are making drives, as long as the French can hold that place and fire artillery into the flank, it's going to start to stymie the German advance. But you need to make some changes. The big change comes in command. A French general named Henri Philippe Pétain takes over almost at the point where the battle is lost. Now, he's probably one of the finest French generals of World War I. Let's forget about that Nazi sympathizer thing from later on. He definitely feels the French army's bacon out of the pan. Pétain had long disagreed with the French pre-war doctrine of the infantry being everything, the bayonet attack being the end-all be-all in war. From the very beginning, he's a firepower guy. When he arrives at Verdun, he recognizes the only thing that's going to save the French army is artillery, and a lot of it. His favorite saying is, "La feu tue." Firepower kills, and in case I'm being obtuse, firepower kills. One of his second favorite saying is, artillery conquers, infantry merely occupies. So to have the artillery to do this killing task, to keep the Germans at bay, I would argue that he actually creates modern generalship. Modern generals like to think that they are the great men on horseback, riding and pointing in all directions. But reality, what generals are in the modern sense are resource managers. Manage resource, establish systems. Here at Verdun, Pétain is establishing systems. He is consolidating artillery, taking it away from a number of his subordinates so he can actually slam it around the battlefield as a big hammer. But he's got a challenge. If he's going to use artillery as a big hammer, he has to be able to see the targets. The Germans had massed fighter planes on this front. He knows if he can't see, he can't make the artillery work. So he turns to Tournecat de Rose, his chief of air, and says this, "Rose, I am blind, sweep the skies." One of the spin-off technologies that really come out of World War I is air power. And you see the rapid development, just for examples of the Germans on the right-hand side here. The one on the top, the Taube, is the basic German aircraft going into World War I. Let's be honest. The Wright brothers are only 13 years prior to this, okay? Not even that, 11 years prior to this. It's basically a motorized box kite. But then you start to see how rapidly technology develops. In fact, the next one, the Faulkner is the world's first purpose-built fighter plane. And you need a purpose-built fighter plane because from the very beginning, the most important mission that aviation does in World War I is artillery spotting and reconnaissance. Let me see the battlefield. And the minute the Germans figured this out, the minute they filled a plane to try to shoot down the other guy's eyes. But now we're back to keeping up with the Joneses so you can kill them. The minute that the Germans come out with a fighter plane, it forces the British and the French to come out with their fighter plane. And then, well, we need something better. And in the air, this is where you see that quicker than anything else. Just an iota of change in speed, in altitude, in armament literally means the difference between life and death. And if you're caught on the backside of that, like happens with the Allies when the Faulkner comes in, the life expectancy of your pilots are numbered in days or maybe a couple of weeks. The rapid pace of this technological change means that the operational life of a fighter plane on the Western Front, 6 to 8 months. In other words, you have fielded a new aircraft, knowing damn well 6 to 8 months later, it's obsolete. And that puts a massive strain on engineers and designers to always be keeping up with the Joneses. As this technology of aerial spotting is developing, you get other spin-off technologies. You remember that big radio van that we talked about with technology weighing over 1,000 pounds. The demands of being able to see the artillery and spot the enemy artillery is leading to miniaturization. This is a 1916 British receiver set. It's with firing batteries. The aircraft has a set that's just slightly bigger than this. So you go from something that's over 1,000 pounds to something that I can carry in a backpack without giving myself a hernia, okay? Now, this is going to matter in the 1920s when people start to want to have radios in their homes. But I've got to feed the beast. So I've got the artillery system into place, the killing system into place. I have the spotting system into place. But last but not least, I now have to put the logistics system into place. The guns have to be fed. And so again, Pétain is creating a whole system to keep this fed. He's out of luck in some ways, that the German ability to interdict the railroad lines going into Verdun means that really for the first time in history, you're relying on automobiles, trucks. Without this truck lifeline, the guns can't be fed. The guns can't be fed, Verdun falls. And you see the amount of effort it takes to keep that going on a single line going from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun. The French will later call it the voie sacrée, the sacred way. That if you were to stand any place on that road at the height of this battle, there's a French truck that is passing you every 25 seconds. Now, that also means that I got to keep those roads open. So old guys like me, no longer good for the front line, are given shovels. And so in that 25 seconds as those trucks are passing, we're out there filling holes to keep it going, 14 labor battalions worth. All of these demands in World War I are going to mean a fundamental change to the composition of armies. We get what's known as the rapid expanse of the tooth-to-tail ratio. In other words, the number of soldiers who are actually pulling triggers versus the number of soldiers who are supplying the guys who are pulling the triggers. You see this just for the American Army, and even this is not an accurate picture. Really, it's about 50-50. And you can see why here. That last line says it all. that the demands of the Western Front mean that the French are firing 4.5 million shells per month. The question now is, what do you do with those shells? How do you use them? Now you're trying to figure out the right amount of shells at the right place to accomplish the task at hand. You see the stakes here. Look at the metric. Pounds of shell per yard of trench. The magic number, 660. 660. This is a pound of shell. If you take 3 seats from where you're sitting, left or right, that's a yard of trench. So I want you to imagine 660 of these falling and you and the next chair over. I guess you should ask yourself, though, if 660 is the magic number, why, after finding the magic number, do you go back to 280? Because there's always limits. Think of the amount of effort and manufacturing that it would take to do 660 pounds of shell for the chairs that you're sitting in here. You surge, you get the magic number, and you can't keep doing the magic number. Which leads to one of my sad quotes from World War I. Now, I often ask my students what they think of this quote. If you look at what's happening here, the officers are trying to find the magic spot, the sweet spot. How many do I actually need to accomplish this? Unfortunately, experimentation always comes at the lives of soldiers. And while this is a hard and an ugly quote, given the pace of technological change in the Great War, this is sadly accurate. And while Verdun is coming to an end or halfway through, the British and the French together will launch an assault on the Somme. Now, you can see it doesn't actually gain very much ground. What should surprise you, though, is the numbers here. Traditionally in war, the kill ratio between the defender and the attacker is usually 3 losses of the defender or the attacker for every 1 loss of the defender. You see here, though, that's not the case. Part of this is due to faulty German doctrine. Always hold the trench, never give ground. But as the French and the British figure out how to finally use the big iron hammer, that if you stop and try to hold the trench, the grid square that you're living in goes away. Now, the Germans, due to their geographic location and lack of resources, cannot match the Allies, shell to shell, cannon to cannon. In the face of this iron hammer that the Allies can use, the only thing they can hope to do is to change some of their doctrine. This is another ugly reality. If you're firing 660 pounds of shell, you are literally changing the face of the earth. So the things that you need to do to accomplish phase 1, get out of your trenches and cross no man's land, and phase 2, break into the trenches, means it's becoming increasingly hard for you to accomplish phase 3. The Germans responded just a change of doctrine. Have you ever seen the movie 1917? That depicts what the Germans are doing in 1917. Giving up ground to go to better defensive position, they now dig in behind the slope of hills. If I'm behind the slope of hills, it's harder for the enemy or the British and the French to see me. And if they can't see me, they can't take out the defenses. Ultimately, though, the material schlock, the material battle, as they call it, is still against them. And the last thing they hope to do is just to use their artillery better. Now, since we're running out of time, I'm going to stop there. But if you have questions about how Bruckmiller and these guys are developing new artillery doctrine in 1918, I am happy to answer your questions.
I was going to give you a heads up that the lights are going to come on, but Yeah, we have time for a few questions. Raise your hand. I'll come by with the microphone. We're recording tonight's program and live streaming it, so we want to be sure to get the audio of your question. All right. Let me start here, and I'll work my way back.
Hi, I'm Rick Randolph. Can you comment on the evolving technology of the shells, where they shifted from shrapnel to shell fragments and increased the lethality?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And that goes back to the war that they imagine. So if you were to crack open the caissons, the artillery wagons that are carrying the shells, the vast majority of them in 1914 are shrapnel. And shrapnel at this time is really a bunch of little lead balls inside the shell. And so basically, there's a little bursting charge at the end. It knocks off the front, and it turns this into a big shotgun. That type of shell is ideally suited for open warfare because you're raining down these balls on infantry in the open. You quickly figure out that once they go to the trenches, it's not accomplishing anything. As long as you can get it down just an iota of cover, they're ineffective. So they're quickly scrambling to field more and more high explosive shells. So in 1914, I believe for the French, it's roughly 75 to 25, in a lot of cases even less than that. And so as the war progresses, it's almost exclusively high explosive, high explosive, high explosive. And then for fun, just some gas too. So yeah, good question.
All right.
And that's the only thing that's going to knock out both the artillery, the counter battery fire, and also the trenches. Good question.
All right, Dr. Faulkner, back here towards the back of the room.
First off, thank you for all your service and for a great presentation, sir.
Oh, thank you.
I was just wondering what year the French 75 gun was invented and released, and if that gun or any guns of similar design were used in battle before World War I.
It comes out, and this is what makes it easy for a historian. It's the model 18, boy, I just forgot it, right? 1897. So it's fielded in 1897. And so while some features in that gun, like the breech-loading mechanism and fixed ammunition, had already been evolving in other one, the minute you put that hydraulic recoil mechanism in, that's a ground changer. So there's nothing like that prior to that period. And even when you come to indirect fire, for example, in the Russo-Japanese War and some of the Balkan wars, they're playing around with some of that. But it's not until the other technology comes around that actually allows you to do it. The problem with the French 75 gun with that is it's only got an 18-degree elevation because, again, it's designed for direct fire. And so you try to make up with that early in the war by digging a hole at the back and putting the trail in it, but that's not effective. So long way around of answering your question, 1897 and really nothing before.
Right, we have a question at the back of the room.
What was the largest piece of artillery built in World War I?
Excellent. By all indicators, probably the Paris gun. The Germans decide to pull a trick. This is where you let a bunch of German engineers go wild. They'll create something wildly expensive and totally impractical. They build a cannon and put it, a huge cannon, based upon several naval cannon guns, battleship guns, that they basically weld together. Put it in the forest of Campagne, and from there they bombard Paris, which is 70 and 80 miles away. What does it accomplish? Besides terrorism, nothing effective. Some of the more effective guns, though, they actually have railroad guns. So they'll take battleship cannons, put them on railroad carriages. They're usually the same size, so 16-inch guns, 15-inch guns that you would have for the battleships. And the range on those go out to 3,600 meters. So quite a bit of a range to them. Excellent question. Thank you.
All right, someone had a hand up. There you go, sir.
Oh, I was just wondering if you could give us the real quickie what the Germans did that, you cut off at the end.
So, again, the Germans can't match the Allies shell to shell and gun to gun. They can't. And so, with the collapse of Russia in 1917, and the U.S. entering the war, they know that they've got to do something quick, that they've got to end the war on the Western Front before all these fresh young Americans can come. And so what they come up with is a doctrine to deal with the realities of their shortage. So Brooke Miller, who had actually made his name on the Eastern Front with these hurricane bombardments, he's not seeking to destroy stuff. What he's seeking to do, well, we can't bring that slide up, is to neutralize them. So he takes the limited amount of shells that he has and does what's called the fire waltz, the fire waltz, to orchestrate where the rounds are going to go to create the overall effect. And so it tends to target, if that's the president, tell him I'll call him back, tends to target command posts and the enemy's artillery. Recognize that if you take out the command post or neutralize them, in other words, you're dropping a lot of mustard gas on them to decrease the capabilities of the gunners, you're basically then denying the Allies the ability to use that iron hammer. And if you can take out the command posts, there's nobody directing it. Because again, as you saw with Bataan, you need that guiding, centralizing hand to do it. As we used to say in the military, when in danger, when in doubt, run in circles, scream and shout. So if there's nobody giving orders, those systems start to collapse. And then it'll also use it to isolate the battlefield. And so you're not trying to take out all the trenches, but what you're trying to do is to isolate the strong points, and then you use innovative infantry tactics, the storm troop tactics, to allow them to infiltrate through those places that you have neutralized to take the defenders from the back. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Faulkner, we have a question from an online viewer. You mentioned the poison gas. The question is, near the end of the war, what percentage of artillery was devoted to delivering gas shells?
I'm going to pass on that one. I should know this one, and right off the top of my head, I would be tap dancing.
Okay.
The problem, and this is another one of those technological developments. So when the Germans first used poison gas in Ypres in February of 1915, they put them in large cylinders, just like you have gas cylinders today. They would open up the cylinders and it would create these huge bouncing gas. The problem is, of course, you've got to manhandle these 100-pound cylinders in large enough numbers to the front line to do it. And if the enemy shell hits it, you've gassed yourself. The problem that they try to do with delivering it through artillery is that you have to have enough of a bursting charge to crack open the shell, but not too much of an explosive where it destroys the gas. And even when they start to employ more of that, the problem is still it requires a lot of artillery tubes to deliver a relatively small amount of gas. So I didn't have the exact answer, but hopefully that get him something.
All right, we have a question back to the back of the room on your right.
Hello. Sorry. So you mentioned aircraft earlier and how they would be cycled out every 6 to 8 months. Would these aircraft be used later on after newer generations of aircraft were rolled out? Like you mentioned tanks and how there were a limited amount. Was the aircraft a similar situation?
No, the number of aircraft continues to go up. Again, the ability of them to see the battlefield means that it is increasingly an important weapon system. So as you make these airframes obsolete, you either take them back to the training base to give your fledgling pilots something to train on, or often the case of the Allies, they just shuttle them off to the Russians or the Italians, where the air threat is not quite as great. But a lot of them, they just outlive their utility. And again, these are very fragile craft to start off with. And so after even 6 months of constant operation, they're already on the teetering of, being a 74 Pinto. So.
All right, we have another question from an online viewer who asked, was the experience of the French and British assimilated by the American Army, or did the lessons have to be relearned?
Aha, excellent question. This is actually my scholarship. I study the American Army. The American Army going into World War I, total strength is around 300,000. That's both the regular Army and the National Guard. And sadly, we had only been paying scant attention to what was going on in Europe. So the Europeans are basically inventing modern warfare between 1914 and 1917 when we come in. And so we are well behind the power curve. And we sort of hurt ourselves with this idea that, well, we're Americans and we know everything, which of course is true, but I'm just saying. And so John J. Pershing has his own idea of how this war is supposed to go. In some ways, it looks a lot more like the pre-war French of independent rifle-toting infantry. But what's interesting is the French really don't let him play that game. That if you can judge Pershing about what he says about riflemen, or you can judge Pershing based upon the type of army that he builds. And the American divisions have a lot of artillery firepower. But what happens, since there's very few artillery pieces for the American soldiers to train on in the United States, most American artillerymen do not see the cannons that they're going to use in a combat until after they arrive in France. Even though we are the greatest industrial power in the world, almost all of our artillery comes from the British and the French. All of our tanks come from the British and the French. A lot of our machine guns come from the British and the French. And so when we arrive and we start to learn artillery, the French basically take the American units and say, okay, John, go talk about infantrymen all you want, but we're going to take them and put them through a full 3 to 4 month training program because this is serious war and this is the big killer. And we've got to teach you how to use it. Sadly, we really don't start to click like the French do on all the cylinders of how to use firepower until really the last days of the war. Our attack on the 1st of November 1918 in Meuse-Argonne is really the first time where we are coordinating all of our assets together. And it definitely creates a problem for the Germans. So, excellent question.
Right, we'll stay back here in the middle of the room.
You've talked about the importance of the logistics chain. Who ended up being responsible? Did we learn on that side, or did the general in the front think it was his to control, or did we build support mechanisms that actually delivered to the front the needed materials?
Yeah, that's one of those systems. I mean, there's always been, all the armies had a logistics system for field operations prior to this. But the demands, the constant demands for shells and, casualty evac and all that really leads to the creation of modern logistics as we know it. In fact, the American Army will establish a whole thing called the Services of Supply, who will be responsible to take things all the way from the port and from the French manufacturers to develop them, to bring them to the SOS Forward, and then from there to do the tactical logistics onward from there. And so this is one of the things we do get from the French. Our staff system, in fact, the staff system we still have today, the S1 personnel, the S2 intelligence, the S3 operations, the S4 logistics, we adopt from the French model. So kicking and screaming, we're learning how the French are trying to organize this massive thing. And just to get you an idea of how much things are changing, this is a great argument that I've heard before, that, if you were to take a British infantry battalion commander from the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, put him in a time machine and bring him up to just prior to the start of World War I, even though there had been massive changes in the technology, he still understood the battlefield. In other words, infantry and artillery and cavalry still roughly operated the way that they did in his time period. But if you were to take an infantry battalion commander from 1914, put him in a time machine, and just transport him 4 years in the future, he's lost. None of the pieces parts work the way they did just 4 years before. And logistics is definitely a part of that.
Dr. Faulkner, I snuck up here on your left. We're a little past the top of the hour, so let's make this our last question. It's from an online viewer.
Okay.
I think you're going to stick around.
And I'll stick around, so.
Yeah, you'll stick around for a few minutes, I'm sure. All right, the question is, how did mining technologies improve, and where did all of the resources come from, like the tubes and shells, along with chemicals for powder and explosive? Weren't the miners off at the war?
Well, that becomes an issue, that there is, there are protected occupations. In fact, when we established the draft in 1917, it's called the Selective Service Act. And there's a realization in total war, you got to figure out that delicate balance. How many troops, how many soldiers or men do I need to put in uniform? How many do I have to keep in the industrial base? How many do I have to keep in agriculture? And how many do I have to keep just in sort of the bureaucratic things, the lawyers and the doctors and whatnot, to make the whole thing run? And so this is a delicate balance throughout the war. And as the war goes on, especially for the British and the French, and the Germans too, they keep trying to comb out as much of the fat as they can from industry. One of the things, of course, that makes the difference is for the first time you're really getting women in heavy industry. Okay, in fact, in Britain, without the use of women in munitions, they call them munitionettes. This doesn't get done. That's actually in the production of things. There is a downside. There's a price to be paid for this. The pyrrhic acid that goes into filling a lot of the explosive shells is toxic, and so they're often called canaries, because their skin is turned yellow based on that, and their hair falls out. So in the United States, of course, when do women get the vote? You can think World War I. Yeah, because the same things happen in the United States. Women are trying to move in to fill the roles that men are now vacating to go to the front. So excellent question.
Well, thank you just for the fascinating lecture. It's can be a depressing topic, but it's very interesting. Thank you so much.
There you go. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming out tonight on a rainy evening. Really appreciate it. Visit lindahall.org for all of our upcoming events, and theworldwar.org for all of the World War I museum and memorial programs and exhibitions. Thank you, and have a great rest of your evening. And be careful out there.
And please don't kill any of the Joneses on your way home. I'm just saying.